Chapter 7. Deep Affection. Octavia and Helga turn at the sound of Royce's voice, their figures illuminated by the soft glow of the village's torches. Octavia's brows furrow, a mix of confusion and concern washing over her face as Royce strides toward them. His heart pounds in his chest, his breath visible in the cool night air. Royce, what are you doing? Octavia asks, her voice steady but touched with curiosity. Royce comes to a stop just a few paces away, his hands resting on his hips as he catches his breath. For a moment, he doesn't know what to say. He can feel Helga's sharp eyes watching him, waiting for an explanation. But it's Octavia he's focused on. He hesitates, glancing between them before fixing his gaze on Octavia. I can't let you go without me. Octavia tilts her head, her expression softening. You have to stay and help Thorin prepare the warriors. I know, Royce replies, his voice low and earnest. But that doesn't mean I can sit here and wait, not knowing if something happens to you out there. He swallows hard, his voice catching. I can't lose you, Octavia. Her eyes widen slightly, and for a moment the village seems to fall silent around them. Helga crosses her arms, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth as she watches the exchange. You won't lose me, Octavia says, stepping closer. Her voice is gentle but firm. I can handle myself. You've seen it. Helga and I will be fine, Royce. You're needed here. Royce shakes his head, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. I know you're capable. I've always known that. But it doesn't matter. I worry about you. You mean more to me than just... He trails off, searching for the right words. You're not just some ally or companion, Octavia. You're... Enough, Helga interrupts, with a playful roll of her eyes, though her tone carries a measure of authority. We don't have time for heartfelt declarations, farm boy. She steps forward and places a hand on Royce's shoulder, her grip surprisingly firm. Your place is here. Thorin needs your help. Octavia and I can move faster on our own. Trust her. Trust us. Octavia glances at Helga, then back at Royce. Her lips press into a faint smile as she reaches out, placing a hand on his arm. I'll come back, I promise. Royce meets her gaze, his jaw tightening. Finally, he exhales and nods, though the worry doesn't leave his eyes. Be careful, he says quietly. Octavia nods in return, her hand lingering on his arm for a brief moment before she pulls away. She turns and follows Helga into the night, their silhouettes fading into the shadows beyond the torchlight. Royce watches them until they disappear, a knot tightening in his chest. He stands there for a moment, the weight of the coming battle pressing heavily on him. Finally, he turns back toward the village. If he couldn't go with her, he'd do everything in his power to make sure everyone was ready when she returned. Royce walks toward the large hut where Thorin stands, his broad silhouette outlined by the flickering torchlight. Thorin observes the village with a steady gaze. As Royce approaches, Thorin turns to him, his hardened face softening lightly. He places a reassuring hand on Royce's shoulder. They'll be fine, Thorin says, his voice calm yet firm. They're both very capable. Royce nods, though his heart remains heavy. Thorin gestures for him to follow. Come now. Let's see what we're working with. Ingvar joins them, leading the way to a small storage building on the edge of the village square. The faint sound of metal scraping and murmured conversation drifts through the air. Inside, the group of men and women prepare for battle ahead. Some are seasoned fighters moving with purpose and efficiency, while others fumble nervously, their hands trembling as they secure their armor or strap their weapons to their belts. The stockpile of weapons is modest. Shields with faded paint, spears with splintered shafts, swords and axes dulled by years of use. Thorin picks up one of the swords, holding it to the light as he inspects its edge. He twirls it in his hand with practiced ease, testing his balance before dropping it onto the table with a loud clunk. These weapons are old, he mutters, his tone carrying a trance of disdain. But they'll do. Roy steps forward, running his hand over the worn blade. Its surface bears the scars of countless battles, and its weight feels heavy in his hand. It's not about the weapon, Roy says quietly, his voice steady. It's about the person wielding it. Thorin looks at him, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Yes, Royce. That is right. For a moment, a flicker of approval shines in Thorin's eyes before he turns and strides towards the door. Outside, a group of villagers has gathered, standing at the ready. Some carrying themselves like veterans of war, their stance is confident and their gaze is sharp. Others appear out of place, farmers and laborers clutching weapons awkwardly, their faces a mixture of determination and fear. Thor and Ingvar begin a quiet discussion about the state of the village's defenses. Royce remains silent, his thoughts drifting back to Octavia. He can still picture the way her green eyes sparkled with determination as she prepared to leave. She had always seemed untouchable, her independence and strength drawing him in from the moment they met at the tavern. But now, for the first time, he feels the weight of her absence, the real danger she faces. It's a feeling he hadn't expected, a gnawing worry that grows with every passing moment. He had always admired her from a distance, but now, standing here alone, he realizes just how much she means to him. His thoughts are interrupted as Thorin steps forward, addressing the gathered warriors with a booming voice that commands attention. My brothers and sisters, Thorin begins, pacing in front of the group. For too long, the people of Hall have suffered at the hands of these outlaws, these cowards who prey on the weak and desecrate our lands. He pauses, his sharp gaze sweeping over the crowd. No more. The villagers listen intently, their expressions hardening as Thorin's words stir something within them. Our scouts are out there now, risking their lives to gather information we need. Thorin continues, his voice steady. When they return, we will devise our plan, and tomorrow, he stops, planting his feet firmly as he looks towards the forest beyond the fields. Tomorrow, we take the fight to them. Tomorrow, we rid these lands of the scum who tarnish it. A cheer erupts from the crowd, the warriors pounding their fists against the shields in agreement. Royce feels the energy of the moment, the shared sense of purpose, but it does little to quell the knot in his stomach. Thorin raises a hand, silencing the cheers. His voice grows darker, more serious. Tonight, we stand vigilant. If anything happens to our scouts, we must act immediately. Be ready for anything. The weight of his words settled over the group, the cheers replaced by solemn determination. Royce's heart sinks further, his mind consumed by thoughts of Octavia and Helga. He clenches his fist, trying to shake the unease, but the tension remains, gnawing at him like the shadow he can't escape. As Thorin continues giving orders, Royce finds himself staring out at the darkened forest. All he can do now is wait and hope. The chorus of crickets fills the cool night air, their rhythmic chirping the only sound accompanying Helga and Octavia as they move under the faint light of a crescent moon. The silvery glow spills over the fields, guiding their way as they approach the looming edge of the forest. The dense wall of trees stands like a dark, impenetrable barrier, the shadows merging with the night. Helga comes to a halt just before the forest's edge and turns to Octavia. Her sharp features softened by the dim moonlight. Her voice is barely audible, a hushed whisper carried by stillness. This is not the song I wanted. The fuck? Stand by. This is better. Not great, but better. From here on out, we remain silent, she says, her piercing eyes locking with Octavia's. We have no idea what lies ahead, so stay close by my side. Octavia nods once, her expression steady, though her heart beats just a little faster. Helga studies her for a brief moment, her gaze filled with both trust and warning, before adding, and remember, we're not here to fight. If things go south, you run. Do you understand? She pauses, her voice firm. With or without me? Octavia hesitates for a brief moment, then gives a solemn nod. Helga acknowledges it with one of her own, before turning and stepping toward the forest. The tall grass rustles softly beneath their boots as they leave the open field behind and cross into the dense, shadowy wood. The thick canopy above allows only patches of moonlight to filter through, casting faint beams onto the forest floor. What appears to be a faint makeshift path winds ahead, but Helga leads them several yards away from it, staying hidden among the trees. The forest is alive with faint sounds, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional snap of a branch far off in the distance, but every noise feels amplified in the oppressive silence of their mission. The pace is slow, deliberate. Each step is calculated, every movement made with care to avoid the crunch of leaves or twigs beneath their boots. Whenever an unfamiliar sound pierces the quiet, a rustle too close, or a distant snap, both women freeze, their senses heightened, listening intently for any sign of danger. After what feels like an eternity, but has only been perhaps an hour, they've made their way only a few hundred feet of progress. The forest grows denser, branches clawing at their clothing and faces as they duck under fallen trees and weave through brambles. Octavia's breathing is steady, her focus sharp, but something catches her eye. A faint shape amid the shadows. She freezes, her hand instinctively reaching out to grab Helga's arm. The older warrior stops instantly, her body tense as her eyes dart to Octavia. The unspoken question in her gaze is clear. What is it? Octavia doesn't speak. She merely raises a hand and points ahead to the right. There, barely visible through the tangled branches, a ladder descends from a tree. The faintest glimmer of moonlight filters through the leaves above, casting just enough light to reveal the vague outline of a figure seated in the tree. A sentry, motionless and vigilant, their outline blending almost seamlessly with the shadows. Helga's eyes narrow as she processes the sight. She nods to Octavia in silent acknowledgement and then motions to the left, indicating they should veer further from the path and away from the sentry's line of sight. Octavia follows her lead without hesitation, the movements now impossibly slow, each step measured with painstakingly care. The forest feels even darker now. The canopy above seems to close in tighter as they skirt the sentry's position. Time stretches on, each second dragging like an hour, until they finally loop back toward the path. When they emerge, they find themselves at the crossroads. The path splits in two, one branch continuing straight, and the other veering off sharply to the right. Helga stops, turning to Octavia with a questioning look. She doesn't speak, but the slight tilt of her head conveys the unspoken question. Which way? Octavia peers down both paths, straining to make out any details in the oppressive darkness. The forest stretches endlessly in both directions, the faint moonlight doing little to illuminate what lies ahead. She squints, her eyes adjusting to the dimness, but the thick foliage obscures any clear view. Both directions feel equally ominous, and the weight of the decision presses down on her. And with that being said, my friends, we come across our first decision of the day. Which way? Straight or right? What the hell? Let me just butcher this really quick. Yep, you're doing it, King. Great work. Which way should we go? Straight or to the right? Straight or to the right? Two votes for the right. 2-1. Two to one. Time is ticking down, guys. Every vote matters in this scenario. Even if you don't know what the fuck is going on, your vote matters. Make sure you get your vote in. All you should have to do is click one of the two options above. Allegedly. And hopefully it works. We are under 1 minute. Under a minute. What have I done? Still only 2-1. Wait, what was the final score? I didn't see it. I didn't see it. Did it end 2-2? Sorry, I was trying to figure something out. Usually it stays around for a while afterwards. What was the final verdict? Show 2-2? Alright, we're gonna roll a d20. So, a 10 and above, or 11 and above, goes to going right. A 1 to 10 goes to going straight. One to 10 going straight. 11 to 20 going right. We'll leave it up to fate. Looks like we're going right. Looks like we're going right. Octavia, knowing there isn't the correct choice, only a choice made by a gut feeling, points to the right. Helga gives her a smirk, her face barely visible even though she's just a few feet away. Helga takes a moment scanning in all directions, ensuring it's safe to cross over the path. Finally, she crosses left or right, swiftly yet silently. Octavia follows suit. They continue down the path that veered right, shadowing it as they move. They remain cautious, moving through the forest's natural obstacles. Patches of thick underbrush, twisted brambles, fallen trees, and uneven ground. Each step feels deliberate, every movement careful to avoid making any noise that might betray their presence. Octavia can't help but think how impossible it would be to navigate these conditions with a larger group. The thought lingers in her mind, a quiet realization that even reaching this base with an army would be an exhausting and precarious effort. Helga suddenly raises a hand, signaling a stop. Octavia freezes in place, her senses on high alert. Helga crouches low, motioning for Octavia to come forward. Octavia complies, carefully stepping to Helga's side and lowering herself to match her posture. Helga points through the dense trees ahead, and Octavia's eyes follow the gesture. Flickers of torchlights pierce the darkness, casting warm, dancing glows that illuminate the faint outlines of what lies ahead. The path they've been skirting leads into an open clearing. At the center of the clearing stands a wooden gate, flanked on either side by two small watchtowers, and on either side of the towers, a sturdy wooden wall forms a perimeter around what appears to be a camp. The structure is crude but strong, made from thick logs bound tightly together, and stretches out slightly to the left and right, encircling whatever lies within. Octavia narrows her eyes, studying the gate and the towers. A single sentry stands atop each tower, their silhouettes barely visible against the faint light of the torches mounted on the wall. Both of them seem alert, their heads turning methodically as they scan the forest beyond the clearing, watching for any signs of movement. She shifts slightly, craning her neck in an attempt to see what lies beyond the wall. From their current position, the interior of the base is completely obscured. Helga nudges her shoulder gently, pulling her attention back. She gestures for them to move, pointing to the edge of the clearing where the trees offer more cover. Sticking to the forest edge, the two begin to circle the base. Helga moves like a shadow, her movements smooth and soundless, and Octavia does her best to follow her example. At various points, Helga stops, kneeling to observe the base from different angles, but each vantage point offers little more than the same impenetrable wall and watchful sentries. Finally, they reach the far side of the fortress, where the terrain rises to a higher elevation. From this new position, Helga motions for Octavia to join her. The two crouch low, careful to keep the trees between them and any sentry that might be peering at them. The elevated view offers their first glimpse of the interior. Within the wooden walls, about 10 to 12 buildings stand scattered across the open space. The structures are rudimentary, like barracks, storage sheds, and a central gathering hall. Shadows occasionally glimmer between the buildings, figures moving about, though the dim torchlights make it impossible to count their numbers accurately. Helga leans in close to Octavia, her voice barely a whisper. This is it. The numbers seem smaller than expected, but it's still more than enough to pose a threat. Octavia nods, her eyes locked on the movement inside. She notes the positioning of the buildings and the limited paths between them, quietly analyzing the layout. The walls are strong, she whispers back, and the sentries, they're disciplined. This isn't just some disorganized ramble. Helga nods in agreement, her sharp eyes scanning for weak points. We'll need a full report to bring back to Thorin. Let's see if we can spot the leader or anything that could give us an advantage. They stay low, taking their time to observe as much as they can without revealing their position. The occasional clatter of metal from within the base reaches their ears, perhaps weapons being prepared or gear being shifted. Octavia's stomach tightens as she imagines what might happen if the presence is detected. After about an hour of observation, Helga touches Octavia's arm, a signal that it's time to move. Octavia gives one last glance at the base, blurring the image of the layout in her mind. The two begin their silent retreat, careful to retrace their steps through the dense forest. Though they've avoided detection so far, the weight of the danger surrounding them presses down heavily with every single step. Thorin concludes his speech, his booming voice still echoing in the minds of the freshly inspired warriors. The group, now buzzing with a mixture of adrenaline and determination, begins to converse amongst themselves, discussing strategies and preparing mentally for what might come. Despite the flurry of activity in the village, Royce remains apart from it, drawn to the edge of the settlement where the dark expanse of the forest looms ominously. Standing just beyond one of the last rows of huts, Royce gazes into the shadowy woods, his heart heavy with anticipation. His mind is filled with Octavia, her strength, her confidence, and the danger she now faces. He feels an ache in his chest, an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability that tightens like a vice as he waits, hoping to see her and Helga emerge safely from the tree line. The sound of deliberate footsteps pulls Royce from his thoughts. He glances over his shoulder to see Thorin approaching. He carries an air of calm resolve. Without a word, Thorin lowers himself onto a wooden crate a short distance away. He motions for Royce to join him with a subtle tilt of his head. Royce hesitates for a moment, his gaze returning to the forest one last time, before he sighs and steps back, settling onto a separate crate beside Thorin. The two men sit in silence for a moment, the distant murmurs of the warriors behind them fading into the background as the chirping of crickets fills the night's air. Thorin's eyes remain fixed on the dark horizon, his voice low and steady when he finally speaks. So, you love her, don't you? Royce stiffens, caught off guard by the bluntness of the question. He turns to Thorin, his expression a mixture of shock and confusion, but he says nothing. Thorin smirks faintly, his gaze still focused on the distance. You don't have to answer that, he says, his tone softening. At first, I wasn't sure. His eyes finally shift, meeting Royce with a knowing look. But you made it pretty obvious tonight. Royce's breath catches in his throat, and he quickly breaks eye contact. His face a mixture of embarrassment and vulnerability. He looks down at the ground, scuffing the dirt with the toe of his boot as he searches for something, anything to say. But words escape him, and the silence between them stretches uncomfortably. Thorin leans back slightly, resting his forearms on his knees as he studies Royce. It's not a bad thing, you know, he continues, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of seriousness. To care about somebody like that. To feel that fire in your chest. He pauses, glancing towards the forest as if lost in his own thoughts. But love, it can also make you reckless. Make you forget the bigger picture. Royce looks up at him. You think I've been reckless? He asks quietly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Thorin meets his gaze, his expression softening once again. No, he admits, not yet. But I've seen what love can do to a man. It's a powerful thing, Royce. It can give you the strength when you have none left, but it can also blind you if you're not careful. Royce considers his words, looking back to the forest, his mind still consumed by the thoughts of Octavia. She's strong, Thorin says after a moment, as if reading Royce's thoughts. Stronger than most men I've fought beside. She knows what she's doing out there. Royce nods faintly, though his worry doesn't subside. I can't stop thinking about what could happen, he admits, his voice barely above a whisper. Thorin places a firm hand on Royce's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. That's because you care. And that's not weakness. But right now, we need to trust them to do their part. Just like they'll trust us to do ours when it comes. Royce exhales slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. He doesn't respond, but the gesture from Thorn is enough to ground him, at least for the moment. The two men sit in silence once more, their eyes fixed on the forest. As the hours tick by, the village gradually grows quieter. The warriors, initially buzzing with nervous energy after Thorin's speech, begin winding down. Some stand watch near the edge of the village, their weapons at the ready, while others sit in clusters, speaking in hushed tones or simply staring into the flickering flames. Royce remains seated beside Thorn, his mind replaying Octavia's face as she turned to him before disappearing into the woods. The worry gnaws at him like a relentless tide, but Thorn's steady presence calms him just a little. Still, every crack of a tree branch or distant rustle from the forest sets his heart racing. Thorn eventually stands, brushing the dust from his cloak. "I'm going to go check on Ingvar," he says. He places a hand on Royce's shoulder once more. "Try to get some rest, Royce. You'll need it." Royce nods absently, his eyes never leaving the tree line as Thorn walks away. The night feels like it stretches on endlessly, each passing moment weighed down by anticipation and dread. Just as Royce feels his resolve begin to waver, a faint noise catches his attention. He rises to his feet, his heart pounding as he strains to listen. It's faint at first, barely audible over the sounds of the night, but then it grows clearer. Footsteps, fast and uneven, crops being rustled as the sound grows closer. Royce's pulse quickens as he peers into the darkness. A figure emerges from the shadows, stumbling slightly before regaining the footing. It's Helga. "Helga!" Royce calls, his voice breaking the stillness. He sprints toward her, his boots kicking up dirt as he closes the distance. Behind him, the warriors stir, their heads turning toward the commotion. Helga reaches the edge of the village, breathing heavily. Her arm is scratched, and a shallow cut runs across her left cheek, but she appears otherwise unscathed. Her expression, however, is grim. "Where's Octavia?" Royce asks, his voice urgent as he scans the darkness behind her. Helga takes a moment to catch her breath, leaning heavily against a nearby post. "She's fine," she says between gasps. "She's on her way. We had to split up to avoid detection." The relief that floods Royce's chest is short-lived as Helga strains, her face darkening. "The camp. It's more fortified than we thought. Whoever's in charge knows what they are doing." Thorn appears beside them, his expression sharp and focused. "What do you mean?" he asks. Helga turns to him, her voice low and steady. "He's organized, his men disciplined. They're not like the other groups we have come across." A murmur ripples through the warriors gathered nearby, their earlier confidence now tinged with unease. "Did you get a good look at the defenses?" Thorn asks, his tone all business. Helga nods. "Wooden walls, 2 towers by the main gate. The fortress is in a clearing, so we'll not be able to sneak up on it." She hesitates, her eyes flickering towards Royce before returning to Thorin. "We'll need a damn good plan." Royce's stomach churns as he listens, the knot of worry for Octavia tightening once more. "How long until she gets back?" he asks, his voice quieter now. "She should be right behind me," Helga assures him, though there's a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "She knows how to stay out of sight." As if on cue, another sound emerges from the forest. This time it's quieter, more measured. Royce whirls around, his breath catching as a second figure steps into view. It's Octavia. Her face is streaked with dirt, and her hair is disheveled, but she's unharmed. Royce rushes to her side, his heart pounding with relief as he takes her by the shoulders. "Are you okay?" he asks, his voice trembling slightly. Octavia gives him a faint smile, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. I'm fine, she says, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her eyes. Helga and I managed to avoid the patrols. Thorin's gaze lingers on Royce and Octavia, his expression briefly softening before he speaks, his tone firm. Well then, he directs his focus to Helga, his usual commanding presence returning. We have much to discuss. Royce, Octavia, try to get some rest. We'll convene at first light to brief everyone on the plan. Royce hardly registers Thorin's words, his attention wholly consumed by Octavia. His heart is still pounding from the moment she re-emerged from the forest, unharmed but shaken. Meanwhile, Octavia, though eager to be part of the planning process, feels a wave of relief at the prospect of resting after the night's tense ordeal. Thorin, Helga, and Ingvar head back to the Great Hall, their voices low as they delve into the details of the coming battle. Royce and Octavia move in the opposite direction, making their way to a modest hut that had been set up for the visiting allies. The hut is simple, 2 small beds, a wooden chair, and a hearth with a low fire crackling faintly in the corner. The moment they step inside, Octavia lets out a heavy sigh and collapses onto one of the beds. She doesn't even bother removing her boots, her exhaustion evident as she sinks into the bed. Royce lingers by the door for a moment, his eyes tracing her form, as if he's reassuring himself that she's really there, safe and sound. Finally, he crosses the room and sits on the edge of the other bed, facing her. So, he begins, his voice low. What happened? Octavia rubs her eyes, rolling onto her side to face him. Well, we snuck through the forest without being detected. Royce cuts her off, his tone sharper than intended. Not about that. What happened on your way back? Octavia can't help but chuckle softly, recognizing the question he had been dying to ask from the moment she returned. Ah, I see. You don't care about the mission. You just want to know about the part where I almost died. Royce doesn't smile, his intense gaze locks onto hers. Octavia sighs, propping herself onto one elbow. All right. On the way back, Helga and I got separated. We were moving through some thick brush, and a patrol got too close. They must have heard us. Royce tenses, leaning forward but says nothing, urging her to continue. I did what I could, she explains. I pressed myself into the undergrowth, stayed as still as possible while they searched the area. It wasn't exactly ideal, but after a while they gave up and moved on. And Helga? Royce's voice is light, his jaw clenched. I didn't see her again until we reached the village, Octavia admits. She kept moving forward. Honestly, it was the right call. The forest was too dark and dense, and trying to find each other without making a sound would have been... She trails up, shrugging. Would have been impossible. Royce's expression darkens, his frustration evident. So she just left you there? Octavia shakes her head, a small smile tugging at her lips as she notices the protective edge in his voice. She didn't leave me, Royce. She trusted me to handle myself, and I did. It was the only choice that made sense. I wouldn't have left you, Royce mutters, his tone simmering with quiet defiance. Octavia smiles softly as she tilts her head, her green eyes meeting his. I know you wouldn't have, she replies gently. Royce stands abruptly, moving to the hearth to tend to the fire. The silence between them is thick but not uncomfortable, though there's an undercurrent of unspoken tension. As he stokes the flames, his voice softens. Are we still looking to leave? The question hangs in the air for a moment. Octavia rolls onto her back, staring up at the wooden beams on the ceiling. She doesn't answer immediately, her thoughts swirling. Finally, she speaks, her voice quieter now. It's not the right time. Royce glances over his shoulder. We've got to spend time with Helga and Thorin now. They actually seem like good people. Octavia continues. We see what the people of Hall are dealing with, what they're fighting for. If we left now. She pauses, her voice tinged with guilt. I wouldn't feel right abandoning them when they need us the most. Royce looks back at the fire. After a long pause, he nods slowly. Very well, he murmurs. Satisfied with the fire, he strains and turns toward his bed. But before he can lie down, Octavia's voice stops him. Royce, she says softly. He turns, meeting her gaze. Yes? She hesitates, her expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. Come here. Her tone is gentle, almost a whisper, but it carries enough weight to pull him across the room without question. He sits on the edge of her bed, his heart racing as he waits for her to speak. Octavia reaches out, her hand brushing against his as she searches his face. Thank you, she says simply. For what? He asks, his voice barely audible. For caring, she replies, her lips curling into a faint smile. For worrying about me. For... She hesitates, her eyes glinting in the firelight. For being you. Royce swallows hard, his throat tightening. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you, he admits, the words slipping out before he can stop them. Octavia's smile deepens, and for a moment, the weight of the world outside the walls of their hut feels a little lighter. She leans back against the pillow, her eyes fluttering shut. Good night, Royce. He lingers for a moment, his eyes tracing the soft contours of her face as the flickering firelight dances across her face. A sudden, almost overwhelming urge rises within him to lay down beside her, to feel her warmth, to reassure himself that she is truly there, safe. But doubt gnaws at him. What if that's not what she wants? What if the gesture, however sincere, crosses a line she hasn't invited him to step over? The risk coiled tightly around his thoughts, holding him still, as he wrestles with the fragile uncertainty of the moment. And that, my friends, brings us to the next poll. A big one. What should Royce do? What should he do? It is time to vote. It is time to vote. Did you walk into a smut chapter? Possibly. We'll find out. We'll see what chat votes. We'll see what chat votes. We got a 4. This is overwhelming. Okay. I was a little curious if I wrote this right. So, chat, make sure you guys remind me of this moment right here. I wanna bring this back after we're done reading, okay? I'm curious if I wrote this correctly. I want to see if I wrote this correctly, and this direction will be more intended to the women than to the men here in the kingdom, but I want to see if I wrote this correctly. We'll see. He's been patient. Let him cook. Yeah. How's it going, Rebecca? Sorry, I was in the middle of reading. We have just under a minute to get your votes in. It's still anybody's game, my friends. I've seen votes completely change in seconds' notice. What should Royce do? I should have taken this chance to pee. Although I guess we're not too far away from the end. Allegedly. Allegedly. Less than 20 seconds left. It is a 5-0 vote. And there it is. Lay beside her wins. Let me highlight this. Let us continue. The feeling overcomes Royce, and despite his hesitation, he finds himself laying down beside Octavia. He keeps a small distance between them at first, his body stiff with nerves. Staring up at the ceiling, he feels as though every sound in the room is amplified. The creak of the bed, the crackle of the fire, the pounding of his heart. Octavia shifts beside him, her arm brushing against his. Royce freezes, his breath catching in his throat. But she doesn't pull away. Instead, after a moment, her voice cuts through the stillness, soft and laced with a playful warmth. I didn't think you would catch on. His head turns toward her slowly, unsure if he heard her correctly. But as his eyes meet hers, there's no mistaking her meaning. Her piercing green eyes hold his gaze, the firelight reflecting in them like emeralds in the dark. It feels as though she's looking straight into his soul, stripping away every wall he's built. Royce opens his mouth to respond, but the words die on his tongue. He's utterly speechless. Octavia tilts her head slightly, studying him. Her gaze is steady, her expression soft, but laced with amusement. There's wariness in her eyes, but there's also something gentler, something that Royce doesn't dare name. Then, to his surprise, she closes the small distance between them, resting her head lightly against his shoulder. The warmth of her touch sends a jolt through Royce, and he feels as if the air has been knocked out of him. Her presence is grounding, yet at the same time, it sets his entire being alight. She snuggles closer, her body fitting naturally against his side. Royce remains motionless, his mind racing and his heart pounding in a chaotic rhythm. And yet, amidst the shock, there's an overwhelming sense of peace, a feeling that for once, everything is right. Sensing his awkwardness, Octavia lets out a quiet, teasing sigh. She reaches over for his other arm, gently pulling it over her waist and holding it there. At least try to act like you've been with a woman before. Royce blinks, the heat rising to his face. I'm sorry. He stammers, his voice barely above a whisper. Octavia's body shakes with quiet laughter, the sound both soothing and infectious. Relax, Royce. You're doing fine. She says, the teasing edge in her voice softening into reassurance. She settles into him a little more, her breathing evening out as the tension in the room begins to fade. After a few moments, she murmurs, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. Good night, Royce. Still reeling, Royce finally exhales, his muscles loosening as he lets himself sink into the moment. Good night, Octavia. He whispers, his voice low but steady. As the firelight dances across the room, Royce's mind quiets, the weight of the night giving way to the comforting presence of the woman beside him. For the first time in what feels like forever, he closes his eyes, a faint smile tugging at his lips, and allows himself to drift into a peaceful sleep. Roy stirs awake, groggy and disoriented, as the persistent need to relieve himself pulls him from the tenuous grasp of sleep. With a soft groan, he pushes himself up from the bed, doing his best not to disturb Octavia. Moving as quietly as he can, Royce tiptoes across the room and slips out the front door, the cool night air biting at his skin and waking him further. He rounds the hut, heading toward the back side, where the fields stretch endlessly into the dark. Still half asleep, he sways slightly as he handles his business, his thoughts hazy and drifting. The crickets hum their nocturnal song, and the gentle rustle of crops swaying in the wind adds a soothing rhythm to the quiet night. As he finishes and adjusts his pants, Royce absently lifts his head and freezes. Mere feet away, an otherworldly figure stands, bathed in a soft, unearthly glow. Royce's breath catches in his throat. He blinks hard, squeezing his eyes shut for a moment and shaking his head, convinced he's still dreaming. But when his eyes reopen, the figure remains as vivid and as real as the moonlight illuminating the fields around them. The figure is distinctively feminine, cloaked in an elegant, flowing dress that shimmers like liquid starlight. Long, silken hair spills out from beneath the hood that conceals her face, adding an air of mystery to her already ethereal presence. Royce's pulse quickens as he tries to make sense of what he's seeing, his heart thudding heavily in his chest. He takes an instinctive step back, his mind racing with disbelief and awe. Before he can speak or act, the spectral woman raises an arm, her delicate hand emerging from the folds of her dress. With a fluid motion, she gestures for him to follow, the movement both graceful and deliberate. Then, without a sound, she turns and begins to glide away, her radiant form drifting effortlessly through the tall crops. Royce hesitates for a moment, fear and curiosity mixing within him. Yet, as if drawn by an unseen force, he feels his feet moving, compelled to follow. The pull is undeniable, almost magnetic, and despite the rational part of his mind urging him to stop, he trails after her. The soft glow she emits casts faint light across the field, guiding him through the dense crops like a beacon. She leads him into a clearing he hadn't noticed before, where a narrow river cuts through the earth, its waters sparkling like liquid silver in the moonlight. The scene is breathtaking, almost otherworldly in its beauty. The spectral woman turns to face Royce, her hooded form now standing at the edge of the river. Slowly, she raises her hand again, this time gesturing to the water behind her. The motion is gentle, almost reverent, as though she's unveiling something of great importance. Roy steps closer, his heartbeat loud in his ears. The figure's radiance grows softer, more subdued, as if to draw his attention fully to the river. He peers down, his reflection rippling across the surface. The water is impossibly clear, revealing the smooth stones beneath the reflecting moonlight with an almost magical brilliance. But as he leans closer, the surface of the river begins to shift, the clarity giving way to a series of vivid, unfolding images. The first vision takes Royce's breath away. Two large, massive armies converging upon a sprawling battlefield. On one side, he recognizes the banners and colors of his homeland, their soldiers standing resolute and proud. Opposing them is an equally formidable Viking force, their warriors fierce and unyielding. The field between them brims with tension, the calm before an inevitable storm. Royce's eyes widen as the scene sharpens, drawing his attention to a figure standing at the heart of the battlefield. Himself. He sees his own face, his posture of one of uncertainty yet determination. The spectral reflection of himself stands at the epicenter of the conflict, caught between the opposing forces. The vision strikes him deeply, a stark representation of the battle between the life he's always known and the new path he's being drawn toward. The river continues to shift, showing fleeting glimpses of what might come. Fire and destruction, alliances forged and broken, faces familiar and unknown. Royce feels a surge of emotion, fear, awe, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He doesn't fully understand what he's seeing, but the weight of it presses heavily on him. The spectral woman remains silent, her presence still and watchful, as though waiting for him to comprehend what lies before him. Royce finds himself drawn deeper into the river's visions, the surreal imagery pulling him into its unfolding narrative. His surroundings fade, leaving only the rushing water and the vivid scenes within it. As the canvas shifts once more, he finds himself overlooking a grand hall from an elevated position. The hall is massive, far larger than the modest one in Kulsvik, with soaring beams and ornate carvings adorning the walls. The space is alive with energy, filled to the capacity with revelers, their laughter and cheers echoing in the air. Mugs are raised high in a toast, the golden glow of torchlight reflecting off the faces of the joyous crowd. The scene shifts, drawing Royce's attention to the head of the hall. There, seated upon an opposing throne, crafted of dark wood and gleaming gold accents, sits a figure he immediately recognizes. Himself. Royce watches, transfixed, as he surveys the room, a golden crown resting firmly upon his head. The throne is raised on a dais, further emphasizing his position of authority, and a sense of pride radiates from his expression as he presides over the celebration. But then, Royce notices something, or someone, that causes his breath to hitch. Seated beside him on a smaller, intricately adorned chair is a younger woman. She is unfamiliar, yet striking, her presence radiant and commanding. Her hair cascades down her shoulders like threads of spun gold, catching the light with brilliance that seems almost godly. Her eyes are a piercing blue, the color of a cloudless summer sky, filled with warmth and admiration as she gazes at Royce. The vision zooms in as the two lean toward one another, their expressions soft and intimate. Royce watches, frozen, as their lips meet in a kiss that is both tender and filled with promise. Guilt twists in his chest, his mind screaming against what he's seeing. This woman is not Octavia. The realization strikes him like a blow, his heart sinking under the weight of its implications. Before he can process the vision fully, the river's current suddenly shifts, the shimmering images dissolving into ripples that distort and erase the scene. Royce jolts back in shock, stumbling as the reality of what he just witnessed floods over him. His breath more shallow and quick. His breath comes more shallow and quick, and he clumsily rises to his feet, turning desperately to the ghostly woman who still lingers nearby. The spectral figure now stands directly behind him, her presence commanding and unavoidable. Royce's pulse quickens as she raises her hands with deliberate slowness. With a quiet grace, she begins to pull back the hood that conceals her face. Royce watches, transfixed, as the edges of her features are gradually revealed. Inch by inch, her face emerges from the shadows of the hood. Her delicate chin, the soft curve of her cheeks, the subtle line of her nose, all eerily familiar, yet different in their ethereal perfection. Finally, the hood slips away entirely, settling against the back of her neck. And Royce is struck by the sight before him. Her eyes, initially closed, flutter open with a deliberate slowness. Royce stumbles backward, slightly, as he sees the unmistakable shade of emerald green staring back at him. His breath catches in his throat, and a wave of emotion surges through him, raw and overwhelming. Tears begin to stream down his face as the realization hits him with undeniable clarity. The spectral figure is Octavia, or rather, a version of her, an otherworldly, almost divine reflection. Royce's knees buckle beneath him, and he falls to the ground, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. His hands tremble as he looks up at her. The ghostly Octavia reaches out, her hand extending toward him. Though her touch is weightless, Royce feels an indescribable warmth radiating from her presence, enveloping him in a sense of peace. Her lips part, and when she speaks, her voice is soft, carrying a mysterious tone that seems to echo in the air around them. "There is no need to cry, Royce," she says gently. "Everything, and I mean everything, will be all right." Scene! That, my friends, is the end of chapter 7